So we're moving on to the third and final reading that covers youth drinking practices and suburban night spaces. So most of the academic literature on nightlife, including our two previous readings from this week, refer to nightlife experiences and drinking practices and night spaces in the context of urban settings and city environments and downtown cores and highly populated commercial areas and entertainment districts. But suburban and residential areas are meaningful and significant or drinkscapes in their own right, where people, especially younger people, have some of their most formative social experiences. So take yourself back to high school or even university when you're visiting back home for the weekend or for a holiday. I imagine a lot of your earliest memories of sociable drinking experiences came from residential areas in the suburbs. But for some reason, the suburbs are never associated with nightlife, even though there's a whole veritable nightlife scene and drinking scene in suburbia that provides a viable alternative to those urban nightlife spaces. The suburbs offer a different qualitative drinking experience, different rhythms and slower rhythms compared to the hustle and bustle and glitz and glamour of that shell game of fast-paced city nightlife. Suburban nightlife and drinking practices can have a more laid-back and casual atmosphere. In reference to the previous reading, it's I hate to use that word again, but it's more deterritorialized. It's less engulfed in the big bright lights and the channeling and the marginalization and the exclusionary modes of control, and thus less exposed to that regime of visibility and authority and governance, and thus affording young people more opportunity for exploration and more breathing room to maneuver during their drinking experience. Thus, they're not as tightly restricted in terms of what they can do and where they can do it and when they can do it, when they're not restricted to those authorized drinking spaces. Plus, like I said, downtown nightlife is such a production in itself. You need to get all gussied up and put on airs and commute downtown. Whereas if you're not going out, the suburbs can provide a valuable alternative experience to consuming nightlife in city centers. And the suburbs can even be more appealing to the youth when they're seeking nightlife experiences for various reasons, which we'll get into. But again, there's this ongoing dialectical tension because the places available to drink in the suburbs, such as one's mom's basement or a park or a backyard or front yard or just the not so busy suburban streets. None of those places are authorized or legitimized by the reigning discourse on nightlife. Like, remember that slide on mediated nightlife? All the TV shows that claim to portray and depict representations of nightlife. Did a single one take place in the suburbs, let alone in any drinking space that isn't authorized as an establishment? And those mediated representations of nightlife play a role in channeling. Remember I said that part of channeling was advertising? Those TV shows are advertisements for a certain prescribed, preordained form of nightlife. And as with any discourse, there are value judgments and norms bundled in. And suburbs as a norm are kind of looked down upon as a potential nightlife spot. Like, oh, really? You're drinking there? In addition to all sorts of formal ordinances, like city planners and local governments are responsible for handing out drinking licenses, so that obviously the powers that be want you young people to be drinking in licensed and authorized drinking establishment because they're more controllable and observable in those spaces. So speaking of marginalization, the suburbs are a marginal or a peripheral drinkscape. It exists on the edge of that map where the fully defined region ends and the darkness begins. They exist on the periphery of the mainstream conceptions of nightlife and start to border into that unknowable territory. And suburban drinking spaces aren't just passive backdrops to drinking. The spaces themselves are social actors, which play an active role in shaping how people experience social life at night, so that the structure of those spaces works in conjunction and in cooperation with those young people, those social actors who create and maintain these spaces through their performance of their drinking practices. So drinking spaces are not simply there, but are active agents themselves with the capacity to influence and shape and enable drinking practices and experiences. So I think this is our final binary opposition of the semester. We've touched on it here and there before, like with Bourdieu's theory of habitus, and I think at least once or twice else. So we've touched on that binary opposition between structure and agent. And once again, just like all other binaries, the examples that we're talking about in our everyday experiences blur the line, blur the distinction between those two polar opposite, so that the structure has a little bit of agency. And as with Bourdieu's habitus, agency has a little structure. A lot of our agency already comes pre-structured as part of that reigning discourse and its entailing subject positions. So there's a reciprocal relationship here between the young people who are actively producing their drinking spaces through their various movements and practices and relations, thus creating their own drinking atmospheres. But the atmosphere itself is also strongly influenced by the structure of these social spaces and what that structure allows for in terms of the agents operating within it. So aspects of the structure, the smells, the sights, the sounds, all the lights or relative lack of lighting, the temperature, the location, the layout, all these structural features help determine where, when, and how we drink. For young people, there's no one single definitive way to drink. Drinking is a diverse and heterogeneous practice, with many young people moving between different drinking spaces over the span of one night in order to have different drinking experiences. So maybe there's a certain vibe, certain atmosphere that they want to find and pursue, or other atmospheres that they want to avoid. So each drinking space will have its own correlating reputation based on, again, structural features like its location, but also the agents who comprise that drinking space, whether they be high-class people or working-class patrons. That'll help define the identity, the atmosphere, the vibe, the scene of that nightlife space. Like they could say, oh, that bar is a bit too highfalutin for me tonight. I want to be more casual. Or, oh, that bar, I've heard it's a bit low class. I'm looking for a different type of drinking experience tonight, a more high class one. So those people are making implicit value judgments in deciding which night spaces to seek out or avoid, judgments regarding what and who is desirable in terms of where to go for a nightlife experience and who to socialize with, and how to go about getting intoxicated for revelry. So habitus and various social class distinctions come into play here, where drinking spaces will be chosen that align with one's class sensibilities. Or if they're deliberately looking for an experience that flies in the face of what they're used to, then they will deliberately seek out an experience that is radically different from their own habitus that they're used to. But that decision is still being made with reference to their existing habitus, one way or the other. They're taking that into account. Maybe not consciously, because I doubt a lot of them know the word habitus, but subconsciously they're using it to decide where and how to drink. And with whom. So affordable places aren't necessarily always seen as desirable, and expensive places aren't always seen in negative terms, depending on what that person wants out of their specific drinking experience that night. Perhaps they want to treat themselves that night and go all out, or they don't feel really up to it that night. So they're just seeking something a bit more predictable and consistently reliable. And this can drive a lot of young people away from those authorized drinking spaces because they associate those pubs and bars with a certain class or group of people, maybe older people or pretentious people, thus making these commercial drinkscapes seem less desirable in young people's minds when choosing when to where to consume alcohol. Or maybe if you are underage, then getting into a bar is seen as a huge coup, as a huge accomplishment. That's something that could be very desirable. But if you're already of age and you go to a bar and it's just a bunch of underage kids trying to get in and then giggling once they do get in, like, I can't believe we're here, then you're probably going to see that as kind of lame. So young people, depending on what they're looking for on any given night for their nightlife experience, can seek out certain places that check off all the boxes and meet that nightlife consumers' requirements for the night, so that young people aren't passive as to where and how and when they drink. They have the ability to craft and govern their own drinking spaces so that they can consume alcohol in conditions of their own making. These spaces are co-constituted. They're jointly created by the agency of the young people who occupy them, as well as the materiality of the spaces surrounding them in their drinking practices. Like I said, the materiality of the space is kind of the space's agency, not the space agency, but the agency that the space, the structure wields and exercises and activates in conjunction, in interaction with the social actors and agents, aka the young people. So there's a lot of self-governance going on here that runs contrary to governing forces that would prefer to stabilize and limit youth drinking practices and experiences to certain discursively authorized areas, such as those commercial drinking establishments. So each drinking space has its own multi-sensorial and affective atmosphere, which includes the spatial arrangements, so like the floor layout and seating arrangements and placement of various spatial features, the decor, so the theme that establishment has, whether it's like an Irish bar or a swanky cocktail lounge, or like the Hard Rock Cafe, which has all sorts of musical memorabilia hung on the walls of that establishment, or various sports bars that have a bunch of sports related decor, and also the colors. So again, this relates to the theme. Usually a restaurant or a bar has some sort of colored theme, like a bar named Rouge. You might see a lot of red in that club because rouge is French for red. And the lighting, so the various light shows or bright lights or lack of lighting, the sound, so the music that's playing, the smells or odors. Maybe there's a palpable scent of perfume, or maybe it's like a dance club and it kind of smells like sweat, or it smells like alcohol, or maybe it's like a smoking club and it smells like smoke. And the food that's on the menu and the drinks that are on offer, and the textures, so what they got, like wood furniture or metallic furniture. Like a lot of Gastown clubs have like that old-fashioned rustic oak texture featured heavily, and then if you go to Granville, it's a different set of like more glossy textures. And the temperature, whether it's a bit chilly or it's a bit too hot, maybe the air conditioner is broken, or maybe it's New Year's Eve and it's freezing outside. The history of that location, so like I said with Greenwich Village, the clubs that are still in operation in Greenwich Village to present day are going to have a lot of history to them, and that history is interwoven with LGBTQ activism. And I imagine that's going to affect the atmosphere. I imagine due to that history, you won't have many anti-gay people going to that club or frequenting that establishment. The practices that prevail. So maybe a bar has this fun thing where like whenever anyone orders a specialty shot, they like ring a cowbell. Or maybe they find out it's your birthday, they sing you a song and give you a little birthday cake. There are all these traditions and conventional practices. And again, not just in authorized drinking establishments, just casual suburban drinking spaces. Maybe in your mom's basement, you guys have like a certain game you play or a certain tradition. When I was in undergrad, there was a practice called icing. And if you got iced, that meant that you unsuspectedly encountered a Smirnoff Ice, a bottle of Smirnoff Ice that was hidden inconspicuously by someone you knew, and they would be waiting for you to unsuspectingly find it. And then once you do, then you've been iced, and then you're forced to drink that. Like you gotta get on one knee and like put a hand on your head and just chug it. It was a foolish practice, but a practice that's characteristic of that drinking space. And the positions of bodies, so how they are oriented in relation to each other. So is there like a dance floor? Is there like are there stools at the bar? How are people placed in respect to one another on the social field of that drinking space? And just the overall mood of the environment and its occupants. Like imagine if this is taking place in a city that just experienced a terrible tragedy. That might put a damper on the mood. It might make people kind of standoffish and uneased. Or maybe your local city just won a sports championship. Then the mood, kind of regardless of any of the other stuff, like if Vancouver won a Stanley Cup or Toronto won a Stanley Cup or Montreal, people would be partying regardless of the spatial arrangements or decor or colors or smell or food. So all of these, this whole array of disjunctive elements coalesce and converge to constitute a certain atmosphere. Could be a light atmosphere, a lighthearted atmosphere, a joyous, revelous atmosphere. Could be a dirty atmosphere, a seedy atmosphere, like one of those billiard pool halls, those smoky billiard rooms. Could be a disarming atmosphere that makes you feel at ease, or it could be a kind of foreboding atmosphere that makes you feel kind of weird. And oftentimes the way these elements combine, it's very unpredictable. Like a nightclub could be trying its best to do everything right. They work with sultans to get the spatial arrangements and the decor and the lighting and the colors all perfect, but maybe one other element is missing or gone awry. Maybe the temperature is really cold or the location is bad, and that's enough to turn people away despite the owners and operators' best attempts and intentions at facilitating an atmosphere that's conducive to revelry and partying. So you probably experienced that before. You've gone to a restaurant or some sort of bar, and like you can't quite put your finger on it, but something seems off. Like objectively, just looking around, like it checks off all the boxes of things that space should have, but there's a bit of subjectivity in there too. It's how you feel subjectively, and your subjective feelings are contributing to the mood. If everyone is in a dour mood or everyone is in a happy mood, that'll contribute to the atmosphere, the overall atmosphere. So it's multisensorial in the sense that atmosphere is discerned by each of our faculties, our sensory faculties respectively. And it's affective, it's affective in the sense that it plays a role in our emotions, and our emotions play a role in the atmosphere. So people contribute to the atmosphere, but are also subject to it and influenced by it, thus blurring the lines between structure and agency and destabilizing that binary opposition. So that atmosphere is the sum of the non-human, that is the material elements, and the human, that is the individual elements, and the more than human, that is the collective elements, that jointly constitute the whole of the drinking space. And depending on its atmosphere, a space could attract people or channel people in certain ways or repel them and prime them to act in certain ways. So for example, let's talk about the manipulation of sound to get people to act in certain ways at a club. Let's say you're at a club and the dance floor isn't really populated. Everyone's kind of standing or sitting along the edges and no one's really dancing, and it's kind of creating an awkward atmosphere. Like people are very overly self-aware that no one's dancing. But then the DJ plays everyone's favorite song and everyone's just like, oh, this is my jam, I gotta dance to this. And they all rush to the dance floor, thus creating a great dance floor atmosphere. But then the owners and operators of the club are realizing that everyone's dancing, no one's drinking. We need them to spend a bit more money. So next song you play, DJ, don't play a catchy one. Play a less catchy song that's going to drive some of the patrons away from the dance floor and back towards getting another drink. So that the drinking space is orchestrating and conducting the movements of its patrons. Like if you were to look at that club from a top-down point of view where each of those people is a dot, they start forming predictable patterns of movement based on this manipulation of elements in the atmosphere. Another example is the manipulation of light. So throughout the night, a nightclub is very dark. That kind of helps the atmosphere, makes you want to get closer to the people you're interacting with and kind of create that sensual atmosphere. But then when the club is trying to shut down for the night and get everyone to leave, what do? They turn on all the lights, super bright. They just bathe the nightclub in light, which automatically puts a damper on the atmosphere, and any stragglers who are still dancing will kind of snap out of it and sober up and realize, oh, I've been dancing with you this whole time. So it can not only affect our movements and our actions, but how drunk we get. Let's say you're sitting in that dusty, smoky pool hall, that billiard room with a bunch of older gentlemen grumbling and playing pool. You might feel awkward. You might feel a bit bored. And when you're drinking, you're not going to get as drunk because that atmosphere isn't conducive to getting intoxicated. That atmosphere kind of impels one to keep one's wits about them. Whereas if you were to drink that exact same amount in a more lively, busy club, you would feel more drunk, because you feel comfortable enough to kind of let yourself go. And again, there are all sorts of value judgments bundled into your experience of an atmosphere. So in the billiard hall, where the average age of patrons is much older than you, you're kind of making implicit value judgments of that establishment and the people who frequent it. And that'll play a role in you not feeling as intoxicated compared to drinking in a more lively club with younger people your age, where there are less distinctions for you to judge between yourself and them. And your sensory perception and these judgments made through your conceptual framework kind of work in unison and become attached and associated to each other. So you could smell cigarette smoke and it'll evoke that specific billiard hall with that specific social class and economic class and age group of people. Or conversely, you might smell sweat and that'll remind you of activity and younger people and other class and habitus distinctions, which all play a role in how atmospheres are formed and how atmospheres operate to drive certain groups towards them and repel others. So compared to the quote authorized and legitimate unquote commercial drinking establishments such as bars and nightclubs, outdoor locations such as streets and parks can arguably confer some advantages on young people looking to consume alcohol or just live it up in their youth and have those early formative nightlife experiences. This is not a list of reasons why Andrew thinks you should drink on a street or a park. It's just possible reasons that young people could and have in the past used to justify suburbia and informal drinking spaces as just as valid and desirable. So firstly, the location is more convenient and more accessible. You're often just visiting with friends in your neighborhood or visiting their house. There's no need for you to take the SkyTrain downtown or commute anywhere. Secondly, the cost of food and drinks is a lot less exorbitant. If you're ordering drinks or food at a bar or restaurant, there's a bit of a coolness tax and a convenience tax where you're paying a lot more just by virtue of the coolness of having that drink in that bar and the convenience of you not having to make it yourself. But that tax is typically very excessive. And alternatively, young people could just go to a liquor store or supermarket if you're outside of Canada and buy liquor in bulk rather than pay the gouging prices charged by those bar establishments. Another benefit bestowed upon young people pursuing informal drinking spaces is that there's no waiting in lines or having a bouncer check for ID if they think you're underage, or there's no entrance fee or cover charge or coat check. The suburban space also affords them more privacy and intimacy. And for young people, this can be alluring as the ability to drink outside is seen as liberating. And a strong argument for outdoor drinking is that there's less of an audience, especially if you're young and you're still finding your way around conventional drinking practices. It can be kind of embarrassing if you were to go to a bar and take a shot and then make a sour face. These suburban spaces afford the privacy to kind of work through that and develop those skills so that you're eventually ready for the big leagues. And also the privacy means that there's less pressure to censor oneself. When you're in a park, you could just drunkenly yell out whatever dumb stuff you want to. Might get kicked out of an authorized nightlife establishment if you were to do that. So you can speak more openly and kind of feel like yourself a bit more. Also, they can feel socially and physically unrestricted. So there's space to move around, maybe throw around a football or a frisbee. You're definitely not allowed to throw around a frisbee in a bar. That could do some damage. Also, they can additionally or alternatively smoke or consume other illicit substances. Like I said, most drinking establishments are non-smoking, but most open streets and parks are not. So it gives you the freedom of having a cigarette, or it gives you the choice. If alcohol isn't your preferred route of intoxication, then BYOD, but don't OD, because that leads to a downside of doing these things outdoors, that there's less security if something goes wrong. Let's say someone does bring illicit drugs and something bad happens, someone has an adverse reaction. If you're inside a club, at least there's bouncers, there's security. They have all sorts of protocols in place for emergencies. But if you're out camping in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of your drunk friends and something serious happens, then the nearest help could be very far away. Let's get back to the benefits of drinking outdoors. I just want to make it clear that I'm not a spokesperson for outdoor drinking. It's just something the reading touched upon, and I thought it was an interesting thing to weigh the pros and cons. So people who drink outdoors can be more selective about who they drink with. If you go to a nightclub, you're kind of consigned to be around whoever else decided to go to that nightclub that night, so that a lot of your experience is on the whim of the crowd, how good the crowd is that night. But you can take your fate into your own hands a bit more by not having to go to an establishment where you have to share that space with other patrons. You can just have your close group of friends if you want. You can kind of pick and choose and customize who you want to share these nightlife drinking experiences with. Maybe one of your friends is underage and they can't come with you to the bar, so you can bring the party to them and you don't have to worry about any of your friends getting excluded. You guys can do the exclusion and choose specifically who you want to drink with. And all of these benefits contribute to a situation where the young people can create their own drinking atmosphere. Like I said, with all those elements listed on the previous slide, young people can customize those elements to a much greater degree than they could if they were to go to a club. Everything in that situation is already decided for them. Pretty much the only agency they can wield in those establishments is just what to consume and how much to consume it. And remember, that's what capitalist wants you to do. It wants to limit your choices so that your subject position is primarily that of a consumer. And I forgot to mention with the playing football example, you can also choose your own music. You can be your own DJ. Heck, you can even turn the flashlights on your phones and you got some light going on too. You got a whole light show. So most of those elements are manipulable. Smell, maybe less so, but there's so much more room for those young people to wield their agency and curate their own drinking experience. So remember that nightlife as a rite of passage that I discussed near the beginning of the lecture, and that experimentation of styles of public expression and forms of self. This is arguably an even better playground to experiment with that sense of self as one emerges into adulthood, because you can kind of taper it to your experience level so that you can kind of ease into it and transition much more easily into being a part of nightlife than if you were just to be thrown into a club at 18 without any prior social nightlife drinking experience. But as I said, there are downsides too. The first and foremost being, like I said, the safety aspect. Drinking outdoors in unsupervised areas is considered quite risky, but part of the benefit is in the risk of being out of sight from the authorities and your parents. You kind of need that in order to start experimenting with styles of self and initiating that rite of passage and forming the identity of one's nocturnal self. And also reputation to some degree. Like I said, drinking in one's mom's basements or in the park can be socially acceptable up to like a certain age. But then once people start getting their fake IDs, or if they reach the age where there's legal drinking age, then that might seem kind of childish or immature, or just an inferior way of drinking, a lower class way of pursuing nightlife. So there's a bit of a stigma attached to it, as some people hold a critical attitude to others and their social status for consuming alcohol in parks. Not that caring what other people think should ever be a reason for you not to do something, but there are stereotypes attached to social practices, including this one, and derogatory socially constructed meanings discursively attached to this specific practice in this specific place.